Really should send this out. Today's daf is Masechta Zevachim Daf Nun. And the way to understand this daf is very simple with this chart. The chart is on the screen over here. And basically, it is saying like this. What the Gemara is teaching you over here, a law that uniquely applies to Kachim. That means it's a teacher and a student. One Kachim A is teaching Kachim B. So if it learned its original idea from a hekesh from somewhere else, there's a question: Can it teach it to another part of Kachim with a hekesh? So if the teacher learned its idea from a hekesh, can it teach it with a hekesh? If it learned it from a hekesh, can it teach it to another area in Kachim with a gzeir shava? If it learned it with a hekesh, can it teach it with a kal v'chomer? And we're going to have to fill in with this whole chart. If it learned it with a hekesh, can it teach it with a binyanav? If it learned it from a gzeir shava, can it teach it to somebody else in Kachim with a hekesh and gzeir shava and kal v'chomer? You'll see how it goes. So far, we've discussed an idea that if Kachim A, okay, we'll call this Kachim A, okay? Kachim A learned a new idea from a Hekesh. The Gemara taught us that it cannot reteach that to Kachim B with a Hekesh. It wouldn't work by Kachim. In every other area in Torah, if something is learned from a hekesh, it can reteach it to somewhere else with a hekesh, not in kachim. It doesn't work in kachim. Now the next step is something that's learned from a hekesh. Can it teach it to something with a gzeir shava? So let's see. Let's see in the bottom of daf. I'm going to quickly go through it. The Gemara originally thought that we're going to start from the bottom. The Gemara is going to I'm just going to highlight Rabbi Yochanan, and this is a very important thing. Like 5 lines from the bottom of Memtes Mebeis. Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, "B'chol Torah kula, in the entire Torah, lemeidin lamed min milamed. One A could always teach B. It doesn't matter. Chutz min kachim. Kachim is a very unique area of the Torah. She'ein danan lamed milamed. In other words, if something was learned, learned its idea not because it's written in the Torah, but it had a hekesh, it absorbed it from somewhere else. It cannot reteach it to another area of kachim, which is exactly what I'm showing over here. That a hekesh can't teach another hekesh. Okay, now what about dava halamed hekesh ein choize umlamed b'gzeir shava? We ended up that something that is learned from a hekesh cannot. The Gemara concluded yesterday that something that's learned from a hekesh, Rabbi Yochanan said, it cannot. Here you see the screen over here. Something that's learned from a hekesh cannot teach another area with the gzeir shava. So if Kachim A learned an idea from a hekesh, it cannot reteach it to Kachim B with a gzeir shava. Now, guess what? What the next question is? Ignore this square over here. You have a hekesh. Kachim A was learned from a hekesh. Can it teach another kachim via a kal v'chomer? That's where we left off. That's where we're starting from. Dava halamed, the bottom of daf mem chesam base. Dava halamed mehekesh. Choizer umalami bekal v'chomer. Something that is learned from a hekesh can reteach something else via a kal v'chomer, and that is, the Gemara says, mitana be Rabbi Shmuel. We learned that in the early of the Masechta, and that can work. That can work. So again, hekesh, right over here is hekesh, can teach the second question, the second kachim with a kal v'chomer. How about hekesh teaching a binyanav? So the Gemara says like this: Dava halamed b'ga hekesh, this top of the page of Nun. Dava halamed b'hekesh mahu shilamed b'binyanav. Something that was learned via a hekesh, cannot teach it with a binyanav. Omar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says like this. Remember from yesterday that the Torah wrote that you shecht an animal in the north by the oila. How do you know that you do that by the chatas? That's a hekesh to oila. Chatas, now technically chatas, the chatas, if the Torah taught us by a chatas that it's shachten in the north, then the Torah does not have to rewrite it by the asham. It's slaughtered in the north because I could learn the asham from with a binyanav to a chatas. That just like a chatas is slaughtered in the north, and how do you know a chatas is slaughtered in the north? Because you learn it from a hekish to a oila. So also an asham is slaughtered in the north. That's what the Gemara is saying. Amar Rab Yirmiyah said, "Lo lichtav tzafayda ba'asham." Let the Torah not write that an asham should be slaughtered in the north. V'teisim binyan av mechatas, and I'll learn it from a binyan av from a chatas. Right now, how does chatas know that it's slaughtered in the north? How does a chatas know it's slaughtered from the north? From a hekish. So now you have a chatas that's knows its idea from a hekish, and it wants to teach it to an asham via binyanav, and yet it doesn't work because the Torah lamai hilchasa kasvei. Why did the Torah rewrite that an asham should be slaughtered in the north? Lav lememra, doesn't this teach you? Something that was learned via a hekish cannot go reteach something via a binyan av. So that's what the Gemara initially wants to say. So the Gemara asks back, and it says, why couldn't I learn an asham directly from an oila? Why do you say that a asham should be learning from a chatas? Because you can ask a question. A binav would not work from an oila. Just because you find an idea by an oila does not necessarily mean it applies by an asham. Because my time loy asi, why can't I learn an asham directly from an oila? Because I could ask you a question. Ma oila sheken kolol. An oila, the reason why it has to be in the north, because sheken kolol, because it's totally burnt on the mizbeach. So that's why I can't learn asham directly from an oila. So chatas nami ikal mikraf. The reason why I can't learn asham directly from a chatas because you don't have a binyanav from a chatas. Why? Because a chatas is more stricter than an asham. Malakatas shekain mechaperes achade chayve krisis. A chatas brings about forgiveness on chayave krisis. So already you see that the chatas is more stricter. That's why the Torah, because it didn't have a binyan av, had to write by an asham also that an asham has to be slaughtered in the north. So the Gemara says, wait a second, but chada mechada li ase teise chada bitarte. Let the Torah write. So now the Torah write basically one hekish. The Torah wrote it's slaughtered in the north by an oila, and it's slaughtered in the north by asham. So the Gemara is saying, wait a second, maybe the Torah just needed to tell you this by two karbanas. Just learn one from two. Not writing it by the three times. The Torah could have written it twice, that an animal is slaughtered in the north. So the Gemara says, which should it not, which is extra? The Torah should not write that an oila is slaughtered in the north. And I'll learn it out from mechatas and asham. So the Gemara says, that wouldn't work. Malahamal shekain mechaprim. Chatas and ashram bring about a kapara. That's why the Torah was strict. It has to be slaughtered in the north. Maybe oila not. So that's why the Torah had to for sure write that the oila is slaughtered in the north. So the Gemara says, Lo nichtav rachmana b'chatas. Let the Torah not write a chatas that it's slaughtered in the north. V'teisem hanach, and let it learn it out from an oila and an asham. So the answer is, you can't learn that because malahala shekain zchorim. An oila and an asham have a unique characteristic that they're only brought from male animals, not female animals, and therefore maybe because of that, the Torah went strict on them that it should be slaughtered in the north, but not by a chatas. So the Torah had to write by a chatas. So now the Gemara says, okay, leinichta ba'asham, don't write by asham v'teisa mahanach. Let's learn it out from the other two. Let the Torah write by an oila and a chatas, that it has to be slaughtered in the north, and I'll automatically know that an asham needs to be slaughtered in the north. That doesn't work either. Malakanach shekain yeshnam betziba kibiyachim. Those are an oila and a chatas could be brought the tzibur. Sometimes you find the community, the congregation itself brings a carbon oila every day, or sir chatas. So the tzibur brings chatas and oila, but we never find the tzibur bringing an asham. Asham is unique carbon to a yachid. So maybe by an asham, the Torah doesn't mind, doesn't need you to slaughter in the north. That's why the Torah had to write that it's slaughtered by the north by the asham. The Torah wrote it out explicitly by the oiler that's slaughtered in the north, and the Torah wrote it out by a chatas. The Torah didn't write it out by chatas, but chatas is a hekesh to an oiler that it's slaughtered in the north. Bottom line, we don't know. If something is learned from a hekesh, can it teach somewhere else with a binya'av? This remains a question, as you can see on the screen. That part of it. Now we go to the next line. Gzeir shava. Something that, if carbon A learned something from a gzeir shava, can it teach it with a hekesh to somewhere else? So that's where we're up to. Dava halamed in the green. Dava halamed b'gzeir shava. Mahu shilamed behekesh. Something that it itself learned its idea from a gzeir shava, can it reteach the idea with a hekesh? So the Torah says like this. Amar Papa says, "V'zois Torah's zevach hashlomim im al toida." So we have a hekesh that a toida is like a shlomim. Lamanu, what does that teach you? A toida is like a shlomim. Sheba min amaisa, that a person who has to bring a carbon toida, let's say he was saved from being sick, so he could use his Meiser Sheni money if, when he made the promise that he's going to bring a carbon toida, that he wants to be able to use his Meiser Sheni money. Meiser Sheni money is supposed to buy food with it. You could buy shlamim. We're going to learn you could buy shlamim with Meiser Sheni money. So therefore, since a toida is like a shlamim, a toida also can be bought with Meiser Sheni money. Now, since we find the shlamim can be bought from Meiser, a toida can also be bought from Meiser. Now, so there's a hekesh shlamim to toida. Shlamim gufayo manalan. How do I know a shlamim you buy with the money of Meiser Sheni? Tiksiv sham, because we have a gzeir shava of sham and sham. It's a sham gzeir shava. It says sham by the shlamim. It says sham by Meiser Sheni. Gzeir shava, Meiser Sheni, you can buy a shlamim. So the fact that shlamim can be bought with Meiser Sheni money is learned from a gzeir shava. And what's it doing? It's teaching that idea to a toida via hekesh. That's the proof of Rav Papa. And that makes perfect sense. Not everybody agreed to Rav Papa. Amalei marzutra bered Rav Mari Lavina, Meiser dagan chulim be almahu. Wait a second, that's not kachim. Meiser Sheni is chulin. It's not a carbon. Meiser Sheni money is carbon. That Meiser Sheni money is teaching shlamim an idea that you can buy a shlamim with Meiser Sheni money. So of course that could reteach a toida with a hekesh. Amalei. So Ravina answered, Amra Lamed Kodesh. Lamed Kodesh doesn't say that the original idea has to learn it from a Kodesh. It could learn it from Chulin. But if it's learned from a Gzeir Shov, that's the question. In other words, you have three steps over here. A could be Chulin, teaching B, Kachim, an idea via Gzeir Shava, which is the Shlamim. B will call Shlamim. Now the question is, can B reteach that idea to C, Kachim? Which is kachim also? And that answer is yes. So that was the question. Something that's learned from Gzeir Shav, you can see on the screen. Can it reteach something to another one via a hekesh? Via a hekesh? The answer is yes, it can. According to Rav Papa, at least. According to Rav Papa, that's the point of the Brisa. I don't care where Shlamim learned its idea, even if it learned its idea via Gzeir Shav to Meiser Sheni, but it can reteach that idea via hekesh to toida. Let's see if I have it. Yeah. You see on the screen? That's why Rav Papa said, yes, it does work. Gzeir Shava, that's something that's learned from a Gzeir Shava, can reteach to idea, the second idea, via hekesh. Comes the Gemara further. What's the next step? You could ask Gzeir Shava. Now we go to the box number three. Gzeir Shava, if it's learned from a Gzeir Shava, can it reteach something in a Gzeir Shava? Right? So that's the next step. Dava Lamed B'Gzeir Shava, Mahu Sheyalamed B'Gzeir Shava. Something that was learned via Gzeir Shava, can it teach something via Gzeir Shava? Amar Rabbi Bachama says, Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Soilus Murbechas, Lamanu, Levucho Shabbat Soilus, Chalas Menayin, Talmud Loim Chalas, Chalas, Rikiki Menayin, Talmud Loim Matzis. So what the Gemara originally wants to say over here is this. The Pasuk tells us by a Toida, I'm sorry, this got in the way, the Toida, you have to, in Al Toida Yakriveno, for a Toida, you have to bring at least four types of bread. You're right, but one of them is chametz, but three types have to be like a matzah. One type, the Torah tells you, it has to be made of fine flour, not plain flour. The question is, how do you know that chalos, the first type of matzah, has to be also made out of soilus? So the Gemara has a gzeir shava, chalos, that it's similar words, that the first type, also the chalos matzahs pelus shaman, has to also be made of from soilus. Then, now the Gemara goes and says, once that learned its idea via Gzeir Shava, Chala can now teach Rikike matzahs via Gzeir Shava, matzahs, that Rikikim, the wafers, okay, that's Rikike, also have to be made of soilus. So we see this idea that something that was learned via Gzeir Shava can reteach it to somewhere else via Gzeir Shava. That's what the Gemara wants to say. So the Gemara slugs that up. Amalei Ravina, Mamaydim Matzas, Mechalas Gomer. Dila Mamafe Tano Gomer. Maybe this pasuk Kiki Matzis is not learning matzis from Chalas. It's learning Rikiki Matzis by another mincha, where it says in a mincha Ma'afe Taner, it says the idea that it's made out of soilus. And it's one simple Gzeir Shava that Mafei Taner teaches Rikikim that it's also made out of soilus, but it's not learning the idea from Chalis. So again, what is the source? Rami Bachama is moved away. What is the source that something that's learned from a Gzeir Shava, again, something that's learned from a Gzeir Shava, can it reteach somewhere else via a Gzeir Shava? So, pardon me. So something that's learned from a Gzeir Shava, can it reteach it via Gzeir Shava? So the Gemara says like this. Hello? Yeah. So the Gemara says like this. Ella Amar Rava said like this. Tanya Bekirboy Ufirshoy Bahoitzi. Lamed Shemoitzi by Parkoin Mashiach. The Pasuk says all these ideas. Malamed Shemetzia Shalom, you get it out of the base of Migdash, complete the animal after you sprinkle inside the sanctuary. Yochel Yisrefenu Shalom, maybe you burn it in one piece. Nemakan Roishi Yakrov, Nemalahan Roishi Yakrov, Malahan Midei Tuach, Avkan Alidei Tuach. It says Gzeir Shava. We have Gzeir Shava to carbon oil. That just like carbon oil, you have to cut it up into pieces. So also the Parkoy Mashiach should also be cut up to pieces. Maybe by just like an oiler, you have to rip off the skin. So also by these Parkoy Mashiach, you also rip off the skin. What just like the junk remains inside the animal, so also the Torah was makbid that the par koyin Mashiach, that the meat should be covered by the skin. So basically, what we know, what halacha learned from this brisa is via a gzeira shava, that par koyin Mashiach, we learned that you take the par koyin Mashiach and you burn it after cutting it up into pieces. Okay, but you burn it with its skin on. Okay, but that idea is learned via Gzeir Shava from where? From Oila. Now the question is, that Parkoy Mashiach is going to teach us by Seir Avodah Zarah via Gzeir Shava, that Seir Avodah Zarah also has to be cut up into pieces. Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Rebbe Yoima Nebekan or Ubasar, Uparish. We go to Amid Beis. V'nema, that's what it says by Par Yom Kippurim. It says that idea. V'nema lahalan arbasa pirish. It says by Par Kol Mashiach arbasa pirish. So malahala yidei nituach shloi behafshit. Just like by Par Mashiach, we already saw that it's to be cut up, but you don't rip off, you don't remove the skin. Afkam. So also by the par avodah zarah, the seer Yom Kippur, the par and the seer of Yom Kippur, you do exactly what you do by a par kol Mashiach, which is you cut it up before you burn it, but you don't take off the skin. So we see again this idea, a gzeira shava, that something itself was learned from a gzeira shava, that's par kol Mashiach, can reteach somewhere else via a gzeira shava. This was Rava's understanding. Now we go to fill it out again. Gzeira shava, something is learned from a gzeira shava. Can it reteach something via a kal v'chomer? Dava halamed b'gzeira shava mahu shilamed b'kal v'chomer. So the Gemara says kal v'chomer. I could figure that out by filling in the form without knowing anything else. See, this is logic. By logic, this Gemara, if I would like to say, is like a logic game, because once you filled in a few of the squares, you can able to fill in the rest of the boxes. Ma hekesh sheina malama behekesh imidrama devina malama bekal b'chayma b'tanu rei b'shmol g'sham lems behekesh midrama papa inidu shtalma bekal b'chayma. What the Gemara is saying is like this, without knowing anything else, if a hekesh cannot teach another hekesh, cannot teach a gzeira shava, but can teach via kal v'chaymer, right? So Gzeir Shava is much stronger. It can teach via a Hekesh. Certainly it could teach via a Kal V'chaymer. So that's the Gemara saying, so you could put a check mark over there. So the Gemara says, but not everybody agrees with Rav Papa. Okay, even if you don't agree with Rav Papa, the Gemara is going to say, but a Gzeir Shava could teach a Gzeir Shava, whereas a Hekesh cannot teach via a Gzeir Shava, and therefore, and nevertheless, a Hekesh could teach via Kal V'chaymer. So something that's a Gzeir Shava should be able to teach via Kal V'chaymer. So the Gemara is going to remain something that's learned via Gzeir Shava can reteach it to somewhere else via a Kal V'chaymer. That's what the just Gemara is going to say. Ela kal v'chayim, you make it like this. Ma hekesh sheini melamed behekesh. Ibid Rav Nirvina melamed bekal v'chayim. Tana Rei Shmuel. Gzeir Shava hamalamdis b'gzeir Shava chaverta. So now, fine. Now the last question is, so we established this, Kagzer Shava, teaching via Kal V'chaymer. What about a Gzer Shava, teaching via Binyanav? So there, the Gemara is going to say, Teku. Tava Lam Gzer Shava, Ma'u Shalama Binyanav, Teku. I don't know the answer to that. Let's do two more, and that's it. Let's do two more. Now we go to the next line. What about Kal V'choymers? Now we have to start again. Kal V'choymer teach via Hekesh. So the Gemara is going to go this way. The Gemara is going to flip it. If a Hekesh, so the Gemara is going to say like this. Dava halamid b'kal v'choymer, mahu sheyilamid, dava halamid b'kal v'choymer, mahu sheyilamid b'gzeir shava. The Gemara is saying something that's learned from a Kal V'choymer, can it go teach via a Gzeir Shava? That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara says, Kal V'choymer, ma Gzeir Shava she'ened lemeida b'hekesha, mid Rabbi Yochanan, malamid b'Gzeir Shava, mid Rami b'chama. A Gzeir Shava, the Gemara says like this, ma Gzeir Shava she'ened lemeida b'hekesh. A Gzeir Shava cannot be learned from a Hekesh because of Rabbi Yochanan. Hekesh can't teach a Gzeir Shava, right? And Melamed b'Gzeir Shava, but Gzeir Shava could teach another Gzeir Shava, right? That's what the Gemara said before. Midurami b'chama, Kal v'choymer halamed b'Hekesh. A Kal v'choymer that can be learned via Hekesh because a Hekesh can teach a Kal v'choymer. So midurtani b'rei b'shmol einedin shetalamed b'Gzeir Shava. So certainly a Kal V'choymer should be able to teach via a Gzeir Shava. So something that's learned from a Kal V'choymer should be able to teach via a Gzeir Shava. Let's see if I have it here. Yeah. So the Gemara says just this point over here, Kal V'choymer could teach a Gzeir Shava. So the Gemara jumped first to there, and a really established field in that box. Now the Gemara is going to go, what about a Kal V'chomer teaching another Kal V'chomer? And this will end. So Kal V'chomer, Magzeh, Shav Shein Mei Hegman Rabbi Yochanan Lamed B'Kal V'chomer, K'da'amra and Kal V'chomer, Lo Mekayim Tanur Shmuel, Ein Din She Lamed B'Kal V'chomer, V'zeu Gver Kal V'chomer Ben Kal V'chomer Ben Benoishel Kal V'chomer. Gemara thought that you're going to have a three-step process over here, which wouldn't make sense. Gemara wants a straight way to learn that idea. So the Gemara says, Ella, the bottom line, and this will end. Kal v'chomer, ma hekesh, shein lamed behekesh, midrab devivim, lamed kal v'chomer, to Rabbi Shmuel, kal v'chomer, lamed behekesh, v'dutani debei Rabbi Shmuel, ein idin she lamed bekal v'chomer. So what the Gemara is saying over here, if a hekesh can't teach another hekesh, and a hekesh can't teach a gzera shava, but a hekesh could teach a kal v'chomer, so we see Kal V'chomer is the easiest student, so to speak. Then a Kal V'chomer, which can teach a Gzeir Shava, certainly can teach another Kal V'chomer. That's what the Gemara is going to say. So the Gemara gives this a check. Okay, we'll continue. So we're just at the bottom on the other page over here. But you see where I'm going with all these filling in the boxes over here. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
A gute Nacht to everybody.
Thank you.